Hello, everyone, and welcome to I Like Your Shoelaces, a panel about online writing, passion, nostalgia, and special interests. Thank you so much to National Young Writers Festival for having us. We're very excited to be here. My name is Julia Faragher, and I'm joined today by Jarni Blakkarly and Merryana Salem. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to start by acknowledging the country that I'm on today. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm broadcasting from. I'm currently at Bundanon, which means Deep Valley in Darawal, and I'd like to acknowledge the Wadi Wadi and the Union of the South Coast region. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and to the elders of the lands this recording might reach. Would you like to share the country that you're on today too?
Yeah, sure. So I'm in Naarm, Melbourne, and I'm coming you from Wurundjeri country.
Awesome. I am here on Awabakal country, which is in Newcastle.
Amazing. So before we get started into the discussion, we will just start by introducing ourselves. So my name is Julia and I use she, her pronouns. I'm an artist and writer, and I'm currently a visual producer for Love Oswaye, and I write stories for the ABC Siren Women in Sport partnership. I've written for the ABC, The Guardian, and Portside Review. Jarni, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Jarni. I use he, him pronouns. I'm an investigative journalist with Choice. That's my main full-time job. But I also do a bunch of other kind of freelance writing around the place, creative nonfiction on different topics, podcasts and radio work as well.
Hi, nice to meet you guys. I'm Merryana. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a staff writer at Junkie. I'm also an author of speculative fiction, and I don't know, a bit all over the place. I write lots of things, but I've been published in the Sydney Morning Herald and trying to get published in the Guardian. I don't know, that's in the works. We'll see how we go. But yeah, that's me. I also have a podcast called Gay V Club, which I co-host with my best friend, where we talk about LGBT media as people of colour. So there's that as well.
Amazing. I thought we could kick off discussion by discussing some of our special interests. So some of mine include musical theatre, the TV show Survivor, Agatha Christie, AFL M&W, and Love Oswaye.
Yeah, so my special interests largely kind of intersect with my work, but I'm very passionate about nerdy and passionate about international politics and Australian politics as well, and yeah, the kind of communities that build around those online.
I am really passionate about fandoms and how they reflect the real world in very insane little microcosms and issues within fandoms. I also watch a lot of TV and films. I love sci-fi, specifically speculative fiction. My favorite show, or one of my favorite shows in the whole world, is Doctor Who. Very excited. We're getting a new Doctor soon. Primarily a lot of my writing revolves around talking about trends in pop culture and the sort of real world issues that they reflect. Because I think pop culture is always like a little litmus test of what we're broader issues that we're actually worried about.
Awesome. I totally agree. And I love everything pop culture as well. So I'm very excited to chat about it.
Awesome.
I thought to get us started, we could have a quick chat about what we've been loving online recently. What have we been looking at on the internet?
Jarni, do you want to go first?
I've been loving, loving is probably the wrong word. I've been thoroughly appreciating. So most of my online, I do use Facebook and Instagram, but most of my online community engagement comes through Twitter. It's a professional hazard as a journalist to be on there, but also engage in the conversations and watch the conversations that evolve around different events and stuff. And I've been thoroughly appreciating the response and the creative responses around, I guess, Queen Elizabeth II's death, to be honest. Not to say that I've been, anyway. I just think people's responses have been very creative and very, people have been sharing a lot of different historical tidbits and facts and information, but also really interesting opinions and perspectives on how, as a modern nation that seeks to recognize that the sovereignty has never been ceded, and as a multicultural nation as well, how these conversations play out. I think it's interesting that Twitter seems to be a space where those conversations have played out very prominently. And it's interesting when you compare that to people getting arrested in the UK simply for holding signs saying "Not my king," and the public space for this discourse in the physical sense of the word has been somewhat limited, but in the online space there's been enough space for a variety of discourses around that event.
I think that's a really sorry.
No,
I think that's a really great example. That's a really great example of how a demonstration between how the online and the offline worlds are different, right? Because it sounds like from what you've seen, people are able to protest and to share all their different kinds of views about Queen Elizabeth's passing on Twitter that they're maybe not able to share in person in England at the moment.
Yes, but not everyone. The AFL player, she just got rugby player. I've forgotten her name because my brain is a little bit scrambled egged. But she's been suspended for her posts about the Queen, and she's Indigenous, so it's not all sort of safe online, unfortunately, not for everyone.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And another thing that's happened recently in the sport world as well, the AFL men's have been doing a minute silence for the Queen before most of their matches, but the AFLW isn't, because it's the Indigenous round in the AFLW, at least it was last weekend. So I think they did one before someone raised the sort of issue of, is this really the best thing to do in the Indigenous round, celebrating the Indigenous players and the Indigenous fans of the game? And then they listened and they stopped doing the minute silence for the rest of the round.
Amazing. People listening to blackfellas. That's incredible. Wish we did that more.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you both think that your writing interacts or takes place as part of the online world?
I'll let you go first, Merryana.
I mean, this year I became an almost full-time pop culture writer for Junkie.
Amazing.
So, thank you. So, actually writing about what I encountered on the internet has now become my job, which is a very interesting shift for that, because just mucking around and lurking around weird corners of the internet used to just be something I did for fun and distraction, and now it's actually my job to seek out these very strange and big and crazy discourses and conversations, because they might make good reporting for us. I think one of the recent things I wrote about, which I thought was kind of strange, was on TikTok a user had written a big article on the way that a lot of millennials in their TikToks pause before they start talking when they're recording, and they're calling it the millennial pause. And they pointed out in the article that Gen Z, or younger users at least, don't actually do that because they've grown up around recording themselves with phones that record instantly their whole lives, whereas millennials and people who are older haven't necessarily done that, and they're sort of waiting for that little lag that used to happen when you hit a record button. And I was just fascinated by that, because it spoke so much to this personal user's anxiety that it seemed that she had about being an older person on the internet. Because one of the things that she said was that, millennials are aging out of the internet. And I thought that's a little dramatic. I don't think that's true. There are people of all ages on the internet. And so in my writing, I like to sort of see these trends, and a lot of the time I kind of like to argue with them a little bit. I kind of like to bring in nuance. I kind of like to break things down. I know that if I wasn't sick this week, I really wanted to write about people. I don't know if does anyone watch House of the Dragon? Any House of the Dragon? Yes. Yep. So the most recent episode was had some interesting moments in it. Incest. And
on Game of Thrones? No.
On Game of Thrones. I know, shocking. And the interesting thing about it was the way that people were reacting. Everyone was talking about how beautifully it was shot and how romantic it was. And I was just I've been watching all this unfold, all these people like with tweets that have millions and millions of likes being like, oh, the lighting was so good, like this is proof of the power of the female gaze. And I'm just sitting here going, that's a grown man and his teenage niece, but sure. And I was, I was really looking to write something about how, memeing things is very strange, the way we meme things out of their original context. And I'm always sort of very hesitant to take things out of their context. I don't like it. I don't like that when big events happen, like the invasion of Ukraine, people make World War III memes. So a lot of my writing is sort of about actually looking at how things affect people and what things are actually trying to say and sort of wading through all that muck. That's at least my non-fiction writing. And in my fiction writing, I love dystopias and I kind of live in one. So I just like writing crazy stories about that where I take that to the next level. So yes, that's how it sort of all plays around in my head all day. What about you, Julia?
Amazing. I love what you were saying just before about how people are getting too old for TikTok and aging out of the internet, and no, actually everyone's on the internet. That's such an interesting concept. I was having a think about this yesterday about how much of my writing is on the internet and how pretty much all of my writing exists on the internet. I've been published in print a handful of times, mostly by like zines or smaller presses. And I think in almost all of those occasions, there's also been a copy put online. So basically all of my writing exists on the internet and most of it exclusively on the internet. So yeah, I'd say my writing's pretty intertwined with the online world, at least all of the published stuff. Obviously, what we publish is only a fraction of what we write, at least for me. There's a lot of stuff sitting in the folders on my computer. But yeah, everything that I've published basically is on the internet. So that's really the main vessel that I use to share my work with other people, particularly since I moved to Canberra and I live away from my family and a lot of my friends, and I've got family all over the world. It means that my work can be read, I guess more widely than it would if it was just in print.
No, I have a similar thing as well. I mean, I've been doing journalism for around 7 to 8 years now, but that whole time has been in an online space. So it's interesting how you evolve as a writer and change as a writer while what you're writing is still available. I mean, I hope no one goes back and reads the articles I wrote when I was a student because they're quite rubbish and lots not to love, but that's part of your development. I mean, you're growing in this space, you're learning as you go, and in many cases you are putting it all out there in the online environment to live forever or live for a long time at least. So it's interesting how those spaces kind of interact. Nowadays, I feel like I have maybe somewhat more of a transactional or professional relationship with online communities. I'm always using Facebook to try and find cases like people to appear in my stories, people to interview, sharing my content that I've written for other people to read. But so in some ways that feels maybe transactional and maybe not organic. But I'm curious to kind of hear about both of your work and how how you kind of feed into those spaces as well.
I just want to say it's really interesting, Jarni, that you bring up that idea that, you're writing, especially if you've been online for most of your career or all of your career, it's interesting to know that, you know, your writing is sort of out there for anyone to find. And I think for us, that's just a fact of life in a lot of ways. But so I get kind of frustrated, and this happens a lot in spaces like Twitter, where someone will go back through somebody's sort of archives and hold them sort of responsible for something they wrote 10, 11, 12 years ago. And I don't always know how I feel about that because, you know, I've changed in 10, 11, 12 years. And I wish we could just acknowledge that everyone in this sort of internet age that we live in does have like their life online or some portion of it. And I think it's strange that people will still sort of ridicule people for like old work that they have online. Obviously that doesn't really apply to people who have very nasty, awful things. But yeah, I do think it's strange that people are uncomfortable with that, because I think a lot of people still see the internet as like not an archive, but rather like this temporary thing that we can just put things out on and then they'll disappear. But that's not what happens with it. So
yeah, and it's been interesting for me to go from, I was a journalism student who was very passionate about topics of race and racism and happy to write about them and talk about them and write articles for places like Junkie and whatnot, saying, you know, calling out Pauline Hanson for being a racist and whatnot and other things like that. And then I went to working in a public broadcaster at SBS, where what you say and do is very tightly controlled. And if you put out tweets that show any political leaning, then you get called in by your manager and told off. So, you know, it's a real we all wear different hats online at different points of times in our lives. And I think you make a good point that, you know, it's not really fair to hold people in the same, or criticize people in the same way for past. Or...
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I feel like it's also a reflection that some people on the internet, I guess, are less understanding that writers and everyone else on the internet really grows with time. Like I have similar feelings, Jarni, sometimes when I go back and read my earlier work and I go, oh my goodness, how could I write that? Big cringe. But then sometimes I'm a bit more gentle and I go, that's amazing. How much have I learned in the last 3 or 4 years? This is great. And I can see, you know, where the seeds started. And yeah, it's interesting that you talk about your student media pieces, because when I did student media at Worimi at ANU, I actually got emails from past students saying, hey, I wrote this article while I was a student, but I don't like it anymore. Can you please take it down? And I was kind of surprised by how many of those emails that I got. Yeah, which I thought was a bit spicy. And, you know, I'd have a conversation about it with my editors every time one came through to be like, well, what are we going to do? Are we just going to start, you know, pulling all these pieces down? What happens if we set a precedent? If people don't want their work online, even though they've written it and they've, you know, given consent to publish it at that time. So what we usually did was that we started de-identifying pieces. So it would still be up there. It just wouldn't be linked to the person anymore who wrote it. And usually I found that made the person happy and satisfied what they were asking. But yeah, I found that really interesting that people would feel, I guess, strongly enough to email in and ask for their pieces to be taken down.
I can't relate to that because I sort of fell into journalism relatively recently. But even in that short time, I look at some of my early stuff that I did write for Junkie or for other publications, and I sort of go, oh, I've improved so much. There are other articles that I sort of went, oh, I didn't really actually want to write about that. I sort of just felt pressured to, which is another weird thing where I go, oh, I kind of wish I could delete it so that, you know, people would, you know, so if it's my brand or whatever, but like, not that I have a brand, but more just like, it's that feeling of like, I didn't really want to write about that. So I don't really want it out there. Like, as you said, Julia, sometimes I think more often I look back on my other work and I go, oh, I've grown so much. Isn't that good? I've learned so much. Isn't that great? And that includes, like with fiction, my first sort of published fiction online was fan fiction. And sometimes I do occasionally like go back and look at that and I go, oh, I'm a so much better writer than I was then. But I think, I think you have to start somewhere. Everyone has to start.
Exactly. And not only do I do that to myself, look back at my old stuff and think about how much I've improved. Like, I love doing that with other writers as well. Like, I love seeing a writer's journey and seeing where they started, how they're going, how they got there. Like, I'm a really big fan of Jennifer Egan, the novelist. And after I read A Visit from the Goon Squad, her most famous novel, I went back and read most of her early catalogue. And look, I don't know how Jennifer Egan feels about it. Maybe she thinks she's a genius. Maybe she's ashamed of her early work. I don't know. But I went back and read her early work, and it was so much fun to go back and see all the places she went to and all the things she did before she got to what's quite a genre and form shattering novel, A Visit from the Goon Squad. So I loved that. Like, I thought it was so much fun to go on that journey. And, it would have been a really big shame if she'd gone, oh, well, I wrote this incredible book and this one's really famous and successful. Let's ignore everything that happened before then. So I loved going back on the journey.
It would have been a shame if she'd managed to pull it down off the student magazine newspaper.
I've done that with one of my favorite authors is Neil Gaiman. And I made it a mission when I was in quarantine to read a lot of his early work because I hadn't read it. I'd mostly read his more recent work. And I had the same thing. Like, I could literally see, I was like, oh, he improved, because I would read some of his earlier short stories and I think his first novel was Neverwhere. And I was like, oh, this is nowhere near as good as like American Gods and other of his big sort of later novels. So yeah, I kind of find it comforting that even your big author heroes, they improve over time as well, which is, it's nice, it's comforting. And I feel like it would be even harder for them. It's not like they're ringing their publisher going like, please take this really good selling book off the shelves because I'm cringing at my comma usage here. That would be pretty funny.
Yeah, I think it just goes to the fact that as writers, particularly in the online space, everything we do is so public, and everything you are in the process of doing, creating and think, and even if it's just thoughts that you're putting out on social media, it's such a public forum, and I guess that requires a lot of vulnerability, particularly if you are trying to be your authentic self on these platforms.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something you said just earlier about how your use of Twitter and other social media platforms has become more transactional than it was before as you're trying to find stories. And I find that idea really interesting as someone whose public social media accounts are mostly writer accounts where I talk about my work and I post and share my work, and how I've often had thoughts of, oh, do I have my public-facing writer account and then a private everything else account? And then at least what happened to me was I discovered it's very hard to draw those lines. So for the most part, I just have the one account. I talk a lot about my work. I mostly talk about everything else that I like as well. Because, yeah, I find it hard to draw that distinction sometimes.
I just have a real struggle with sort of partitioning myself. Because I guess I was never trained to PR myself, so I don't really know how to do it. I sort of am just always perpetually myself, and I do kind of view it a little bit dishonestly, like in a way sometimes. Not that I think that people are inherently dishonest for creating separate accounts for work and whatever else, but I just feel that if people like my work, they like it because in some part of me and who I am. And so I don't necessarily see the point in separating those two things. But also I can see the value in it for much larger writers and much larger creators, of course. And especially if you're doing sort of more dangerous work in journalism, I can definitely see the appeal of that. But where I sort of sit in the pop culture sphere of journalism, a lot of the time people are reading your work because of you really, and because of the perspective you are going to bring to it. So at this point, separating those sort of profiles has not really ever been a thing that I do. I actually very foolishly have like pretty much the same username across all of social media. And originally I did that because it's, very, very easy to find me, because I thought, well, it'll be fine if people can find me. I never realized I'd be relatively successful as a pop culture journalist and stuff. So I have had random people message me going like, I found your Letterboxd account, and I found your old Neopets account or whatever, because I've just always used like my username, which is aka just Mary, like to talk about Tumblr, like even on there, that's who I am. And it's sort of, I have thought about changing it because I thought, oh, what if someone I don't want to find, like I don't want to be able to find me, finds me here. And then it's like, well, what am I really worried that they're going to find out? That every day I'm sitting there going like, I didn't like this scene in House of the Dragon, wish it wasn't there. Anyway, here's a picture of a nice cake that I like. So yeah, I don't know. I think I don't know. I don't really have anything to hide.
Yeah, I think
Did you write your fan fiction under the same username as well?
I did, and actually, you can, if you Google aka just Mary. It used to be one of the first things that came up, and I did get kind of embarrassed by that for a little while. But then I was like, oh no, like what's the worst they're going to find out? That I was so into BBC Sherlock that I wrote like an entire fan fiction where I fixed something that really bothered me in one of the seasons. I don't think that's the worst thing you can learn about somebody. I personally, if I found that out about somebody, I wouldn't really mind. I'd actually kind of respect them for it. I'd be like, oh, cool, a kindred spirit, so it's my take on sort of usernames in that. Yes, I am a Sherlockian, and I also like Doctor Who. I was not a Super Who-lock. Supernatural, my friend tried really hard to get me into it, but I got up to the 6th episode, and there was a truck that was possessed by a ghost who was killing all the black people in this town, and Sam and Dean had to stop the racist ghost truck, and I was like, no, I can't do this. As a person of color, that's racist ghost trucks are just where I draw the line in things, really.
I was just going to say, I think that I definitely agree with what you were saying, Merryana, but I think it's the place where it gets tricky in a professional sense for me is when you have an employer that tries to control your social media and your presence online and the way that you come across, out of concern that it reflects badly on their brand or their company. And I think that's it's a very murky and complicated space. And, there's certain people that you see online who are, passionately tweeting their opinions one day, and then they get a job at the ABC the next day, and suddenly they don't have an opinion on anything anymore ever. And then they leave the ABC 6 months later, and they come back and there they are again with all the same opinions that you knew they had the whole time. But I just think it's interesting when you've got a space which is professionalized and controlled by a company, or trying to control individual people's personal profiles.
This only happened to me in the context of, with Junkie, it's more like commercial interests rather than political. So because we get ads on the site, if there is a particular company or studio that's paid for ad space, we can't really critique media like from that company, like during that time in the very least. And the only time I had sort of issues with what I was tweeting, I've always been like quite critical of Disney and Warner Brothers and their pitiful attempts at diversity. And I don't even remember now what it was. It was something to do with, I don't know, it was something to do with Warner Brothers. I know that. I might have been tweeting rather angrily at, Fantastic Beasts or something like that. And because we had ad space on Junkie, and because I had linked one of my articles in a tweet that was like, instead of going to see, Fantastic Beasts, the worst movie ever, why don't you read my article instead? And apparently someone from Junkie saw the tweet and were like, can you find a different way to promote that? Because we have ad space with Warner Brothers. And I was like, oh, okay. So it's a bit different, but the same kind of thing, where but in a sort of consumer space rather than a political space. But I don't really think those spaces are separate. It's just the same issue from a different angle.
Have either of you ever left, or I guess felt put off by an online space because you felt like it was becoming too corporatized or too, I guess, influenced by these inauthentic things?
For me, I think it was, yeah, I mean, I hate Instagram, to be honest, and I hardly use it at all. I feel like the algorithm's just very ad-driven and frustrating and annoying, particularly recently. But it was interesting watching everyone quit, or not everyone, but a large number of people quit Twitter when Elon Musk was going to buy it. And then he didn't end up buying it, and people kind of seem to still steer clear of the website. I think it's interesting that the way that certain social media platforms come in and out of fashion based on ownership, as well as obviously based on algorithm and other things like that.
I agree with you, Jarni. Instagram is a mess. The new sort of the way that they do ads and suggested posts over the people that you actually follow, and then on top of that, it's not in chronological order anymore. And Twitter did that too, but at least they have a toggle so that you can say, like, I just want, things in chronological order. I think that's one of the reasons I am still on Tumblr, is because it's very simple. It's just everything in chronological order, people you follow. They have recently added a For You sort of page where they give you suggested posts, but as with everything on Tumblr, it's not very well done. So the suggested posts are like, make me sort of sit there and go, what makes you think I would like this? And a lot of them are for shows I've never even watched. They're like, we think you'd like this show, or like this post, and it's like NCIS. It's like, I've never seen an episode of NCIS, but thanks, I guess. Thanks for thinking of me, I suppose.
What about yourself, Julia?
So I really liked what you said about Instagram, because I've been on Instagram since 2011. And as a photographer, I have been a pretty big fan of the app as like a way to share the photos that I'm taking. But I feel like I'm kind of clinging on to, I'm clinging on to Instagram despite the fact that it's trying to pivot to video and kind of like become TikTok, which really confuses me because they built up this great way to share photos. And I'm not saying that apps shouldn't, change and evolve and try to become better in the, over a decade since they started. But sometimes I feel like Instagram is just trying to kill itself off, despite, having so many users and having people who love it. And yeah, I agree with you about Instagram v Twitter. I've got my Twitter feed in chronological order. I wish that I could permanently make my Instagram feed like that as well. I think every 30 days I snooze suggested posts, and then it stays that way for 30 days, and I just see the people I follow, and then it makes me do it again a month later. But yeah, I feel like, a bit attached to Instagram, and I don't want to let go of it. But if they really go hard on the videos and sort of let go of their photo origins, then I'm actually not sure what I'll do, and whether I abandon a profile I've been creating for over a decade. It's kind of a weird feeling.
I'm curious what you guys think about the way that platforms that aren't TikTok, so platforms, Instagram, Facebook, not so much Twitter yet, but I'm sure they've got something in the works, are trying to sort of imitate TikTok and its prioritization of videos. What are your thoughts on that? How does that affect you guys?
I find it kind of funny that the platforms are so insecure about what they are and the things that have made them successful, that they see another company be really successful at video and think, oh my God, we have to do that, and kind of ignore how they've built themselves. I also think it was even happening before TikTok, because Facebook had a massive pivot to video even before TikTok was big, I'm guessing influenced by YouTube, where they grossly exaggerated all their statistics and watch time for their videos. So many companies and publications really pivoted to video, only to find out that the stats had essentially been faked and no one was watching them more than they were reading, text posts and articles. So I feel like the TikTok thing is just happening all over again. But yeah, I find it funny that platforms are so insecure about TikTok's success that they're like, we all need to become TikTok. And it's like, actually, no, we all have multiple social media platforms because we feel like they do different things or they connect us with different people. And I actually have no need for, 4 different versions of TikTok on my phone. I just want the one.
Yeah, it's interesting, that insecurity from the companies about their own product. But then you do also see it kind of happen successfully. So during the COVID lockdowns, I really got into Clubhouse, which was an audio streaming app, which didn't record. So it was conversations on a certain topic that wasn't recorded. You couldn't record it later or listen to it later. It was just listen to live, and people would have these like 5-hour long discussions on different events that were happening or different topics, different TV shows. And it was just like the perfect app for lockdown, really, to be honest.
I love that.
But then Twitter kind of saw us, maybe, I don't know if they saw an opportunity and basically just created Twitter Spaces, which is now pretty much the exact same thing. And now everyone I know is not on Clubhouse anymore. So, I mean, obviously that the market thinking and the way that different companies see opportunities to capitalize.
Yeah, and the same thing happened with Snapchat and Instagram stories. I remember having and using Snapchat, and when Instagram stories started, I was like, why on earth would I use those? I have Snapchat for a reason. But then Instagram stories took off, and I use that now, and I feel like people use that more than Snapchat. And in a little bit of a different way. But yeah, I think that's another example of how the companies copying each other occasionally does pay off. And I guess that's why they'll keep doing it. And at the moment, they're all trying to become TikTok.
I think for me, the other thing is it's not necessarily the prioritization of video content that bothers me so much. I am a not chronic, I don't want to say that. I don't want to make light of chronic things, but I am an extreme video essay watcher on YouTube. So I watch a lot of video essays. I like the long format, very much so. So I don't necessarily think video is a bad thing, but what I don't like that that these platforms are trying to imitate about TikTok is that very creepy algorithm that sort of finds you things to watch. And people love to talk about how smart TikTok's algorithm is and how it sort of can almost get under your skin and show you things that are very, very, very relevant to you. And I'm not, sorry, Jess is just saying in the chat, it really has taken away that feeling of you actually go into a platform, into a space, and you seek out things. And instead it's like these platforms sort of trying to control even your curiosity of what you would like to see. And which isn't to say that I haven't ended up on some strange sides of TikTok and seen some interesting things and perspectives that I wouldn't normally have seen. I've also seen some sort of quite triggering things and disturbing things as well. But I think the best part about the internet when it wasn't sort of so social media driven was you would just go on there to find interesting things and places and spaces where people could talk about all this sort of interesting stuff and share interesting things. And that is sort of harder to do now because these platforms are making it hard for you to actually go and seek out what you want to see. And I think the dangerous side to that as well is because the algorithms are predictive, we're seeing the rise of all these extremist movements and hate movements and sort of people, there were plenty of people connecting the dots, but the platforms and the algorithms themselves never seem to be held accountable for that in any kind of meaningful way. And I've seen also, just even health-wise, I've seen a lot of the same kind of grifter, fake wellness stuff that you used to see on Instagram being promoted on TikTok, and it lands on my For You page for whatever reason it thinks that I want to see it, and I don't want to see it. But it's not a way that I personally enjoy using the internet. And again, it's one of the reasons that I'm still on Tumblr after 11 years is because Tumblr has never done that. It never shoves things in your face. Everyone curates what they want to see on that platform and what they want to show you, and you can choose to follow that person and see their content, or you can choose not to. Whereas I find TikTok quite chaotic and almost overwhelming, because I'll open it and be like, oh, okay, we're yelling about this celebrity, are we? Right, okay, cool. Didn't realize we were doing that. But yeah, I do have a lot of strong opinions about social media going from being, user-driven to being sort of algorithmically driven. And I don't think that that's necessarily a good change. It's certainly an interesting change, but I don't necessarily think it's a good one. Do you guys have any thoughts on like the almighty algorithm and how it's sort of shaping things?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like you say, sometimes it's nice if the algorithm finds things that you would like to watch. And I think there have been a couple of occasions where I've still been able to discover things on TikTok. Like I found a couple of musicians and songwriters who I've liked to follow, and yeah, exactly. And now listen to their songs on Spotify. So I think there is a little bit of that element of discovery, but yeah, I think I agree. It's much more, here's, all these things on a platter, pick what you would like, rather than, yeah, I guess that more active early internet sense of going, oh, I'm really interested in these things. I'm gonna look at these tags and look through these, profiles on Tumblr to see what I can find.
And it can be potentially dangerous. I remember there was that TikTok from earlier this year about some researcher who started liking homophobic content on TikTok, and within like a few days her account was taken down like these neo-Nazi routes, and was getting full neo-Nazi content. So and she wasn't actually going out of her way to seek that kind of content. So these algorithms trying to decide what we want to see, it can also have dangerous implications as well.
Absolutely. So I feel like we've talked a lot about platforms and different social media companies, and maybe now we can pivot to talking about some of the online communities that we found and we've loved.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, my online community's mostly a professional one through Twitter, but I mean, it's a community that can be incredibly toxic at times and that you need to log off and take a break from at times, but it also can be an incredibly supportive and engaging and enriching community as well.
Yeah, so one of my favorites at the moment is the Lovers YA community online. I remember discovering the hashtag Lovers YA in about maybe 2017 and going, oh my goodness, I had no idea there were this many people out there as obsessed about Australian young adult fiction as I am. And they've made all these lists and resources, and instead of having to spend hours searching through libraries and the internet trying to find books to read, they're just all here. And that was a really amazing feeling of going, I think I finally found my niche in what I like to read and write, and I found the people who are into it. And that was a really great feeling. And I've really been a part of that online community ever since. And now I volunteer for the org itself, helping out with author interviews and editing things and making posters. And now I guess getting to do that part of the experience for people who would have been like me in 2017 trying to find stuff. Now I get to help them find it. So that's one of my favorite online communities, just because it's really nice to get to talk to people about the niche interests that you have. And if you've read a book and you're obsessing over this one scene or this one character, you could probably find someone out there who's obsessing over it too. But I was thinking back to some of my sort of earlier online communities. What were the first ones that I found that sort of introduced me to all of this? And I was thinking a lot about NaNoWriMo because
NaNoWriMo.
When I was younger, like I've loved writing for a really long time, and I always loved to write when I was younger. But I would, I'd just come up with hundreds of story ideas and characters and plots, and I'd write a lot of beginnings of books, but I would never finish them. That I felt was okay. I just liked creating stories. I was going to do whatever I wanted, but there was this sort of niggling voice in the back of my head that was like, wouldn't it be nice to finish something, to get to the end of a project that I was writing by myself. And when I first heard about NaNoWriMo, which stands for National Novel Writing Month, which is an online community where people around the world come together to write a 50,000 word novel in 30 days, I thought it was ridiculous and bananas. I was like, this is just not, people are just being ridiculous. Surely that's not actually a thing. But then I was watching a YouTube video and I heard someone talk about their NaNoWriMo novel. And I was like, oh my goodness, if I actually do this thing, by the end of it, I'm going to have a novel. And it might be garbage, probably will be garbage, but I will have a novel. And yeah, that's how I wrote my first book and wrote my first manuscript. And I've now done it 5 times. And I've thought a lot about,
times.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
That's amazing, yeah.
Thank you. That's very kind. And I've thought a lot about, what is it about November? What is it about NaNoWriMo that makes me write 50,000 words in 30 days? Why can't I do that any other time of year or any other time, any other setting? And I really think it is about that online community of knowing that there are loads of people and writers all around the world all doing the same thing. If you're having a bad day, you can whinge about it on Twitter and someone will reply to you, or you can read other tweets of people who are also struggling with their plot holes or, having a bad writing day or have got writer's block or whatever. So yeah, I feel like the way that I've been able to write first draft manuscripts is really, at least in part, because of that massive online community.
How do we feel / what thoughts do we have about people making the thing they love sort of part of their identity?
I think that's a great question.
Yeah, it's something I've kind of probably pulled back from. I feel like in a lot of ways, becoming a journalist and working as a journalist full time, traveling around the country, you kind of become obsessed with your profession as your identity in both online spaces and offline worlds. And for me, it kind of got to a level that was maybe not healthy. So I definitely pulled back a lot from that and definitely try and separate out my work from my identity, my online world from my identity as well. But yeah, curious to hear your thoughts.
I'm still a big nerd. And so throughout my childhood and teen years and young adulthood, there was always sort of a piece of media that I was attaching myself to. Growing up in the early 2000s, I was a big Harry Potter fan before we knew things. And I've always been a huge Doctor Who fan since I was a kid and gone to conventions and that sort of stuff. I still go to Supernova most years. Haven't gone this year or last year because I was very sick, but a lot of years. So I think what we were talking about before, like where do we find community? I've always found community in fandom because I love stories and I love the way that people build community around stories. And there are definitely toxic parts of that I wish didn't exist. And there is also a lot of racism in fandom that I wish also wasn't around. But ultimately, I still would rather, have a space, whether it be a physical space or an online space, where I can go and sort of ramble about, as you were talking, Julia, like a scene in a novel that I really liked, or a scene in a show that I really liked, or a film. And there are going to be people, if I put the right tags in, there are going to be people that find it and go, oh my God, yeah, that was insane. And I've always enjoyed that about fandom. And for me, that's been my main online community. So as I wanted to sort of mature my writing a bit, I did find a community of other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations journalists that have helped me a lot in this sort of journalism career that I've fallen into that I never intended to go into. So that I'm always learning a lot because it was sort of something I accidentally started doing in many ways. And if I hadn't found that community, I wouldn't have been published in the anthologies that I've been published in either. So I think you can never sort of underestimate the impact of online communities, both negative and positive, and on an individual level, and also just on a wider social level as well. So, so those online communities and being a fan of things, it very much ties into my practice, because I don't think I would have a practice if it wasn't for those communities in many ways. You know, one of the first times I posted a story online was because I'd written a Doctor Who fan fiction, and people were encouraging me. You know, people I didn't even know were going like, "This is such a cool idea. You should put it on AO3 or whatever." You know, and I sometimes wonder if I ever would have had the courage to start submitting things to actual publishers that obviously wasn't Doctor Who fan fiction. You know, if I didn't know that there were going to be people that would want to read it. So I think, yeah, for me, you know, Jess asked in the chat, how does it tie into my practice? My practice definitely wouldn't exist without those communities. I don't think. And neither would a lot of people in my life as well that I love very dearly.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think I owe a lot to the online communities that I was a part of when I was a teen, discovering writing and starting to write more, and the communities that I'm part of now as well. Yeah, I think they've definitely been really formative, and I owe a lot to them. And I agree with what you were saying. I think I also owe a lot to the online communities I was a part of when I was a teen, and they definitely shaped my writing and helped me become the writer I am today. And to the online communities I'm still part of, I've definitely made friends through them, writer friends and non-writer friends. So I definitely agree with that. In regards to, I guess, making the thing that you love online your personality, I definitely agree with you, Jarni, that I feel like I've fallen into that trap a little bit before, and now I pull back from it a bit in, I guess, being a bit hesitant to, or I guess just being a bit wary of when I become maybe a bit too obsessive with one thing. And
in regards to the question of loving one thing too much that it becomes your whole personality, I definitely think that is kind of a trap that you have to be wary of sometimes. And the solution is really easy. You just have to love a lot of things and remember that you're a complex person and that there's a lot that makes you who you are. And yeah, even though I definitely did that as a teen, I identified very strongly as a Hufflepuff for a long time. And that was, you know, probably something that I told people as a way of introducing myself. I've since done the test many times and gotten like 3 of the 4 different houses. So maybe I'm not even a Hufflepuff anymore. Who knows? But yeah, I think the really easy thing to remember is that it's very easy to love a lot of things, and to remember that there are lots of things that make up who you are that aren't even fandoms, traits that you might have, whether you're a smart person or a kind person, and things like that. So yeah, while I think that can maybe be a trap of becoming too obsessed with something, it's really easy to just love a lot of things and to love widely.
I think that's a great note to end on, Julia.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for being here with me today. And thank you so much to the National Young Writers Festival for having us. Thank you so much to everyone who was watching. The festival has so many amazing events that are on. So hopefully you have been checking them out and will keep checking them out. Before we go, did either of you have anything that you wanted to plug quickly?
If you would like to hear me dust off the part of my brain that is my fan fiction brain, I am going to be doing a late night reading, Hugo Award nominee, thanks AO3, which you'll be hearing from me and some other fantastic writers as we put our fan fiction writing hats back on and read you some late night fan fiction. So.
And I'm hosting a workshop on breaking into journalism for young and aspiring journalists who are wanting to find out more about kind of getting their foot in the door in the industry and how the industry works. So
amazing. I'm looking forward to both of those. You can hear me again talking about queer Love YA on Sunday morning in person in Newcastle with Rhiannon Wild and Alice Boyle. So please come along to that if you're coming to the festival in person. But thank you so much for being here with us today. Enjoy the rest of the festival and goodbye.